In the early hours of December 7th, 1941, American sailors aboard the USS Arizona were still asleep. Breakfast was being prepared in mess halls. The harbor at Pearl Harbor was calm, the water barely moving under the rising Hawaiian sun. For most of the men stationed there, it was just another quiet Sunday morning. No one expected war to arrive before breakfast, but thousands of miles away, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers were already launching their planes. Pilots tightened their straps, engines roared to life, and flight decks erupted with motion. Their orders were clear: strike Pearl Harbor, cripple the American Pacific Fleet, and change the balance of power in the Pacific forever. What happened next would shock the world. But Pearl Harbor wasn't just a surprise attack. It was the result of one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern warfare. For years before the attack, tensions between the United States and Japan had been building. Japan had invaded China in 1937, committing brutal atrocities and expanding its empire across East Asia. As the war dragged on, Japan's need for oil, steel, and rubber became desperate. The United States responded with economic pressure, freezing Japanese assets and cutting off vital oil supplies. To Japanese leaders, this wasn't just diplomacy, it was a threat to national survival. Without oil, their navy and air force would grind to a halt within months. Behind closed doors, Japan's leadership made a grim decision. If war was inevitable, they would strike first. Their goal was to destroy America's Pacific Fleet in one decisive blow, buying time to seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia before the United States could respond. The architect of the plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He had studied in America and understood the country's industrial strength. He knew Japan could not win a long war. He famously warned, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no confidence." But political pressure left him no choice. If Japan was going to fight, it had to strike hard and early. The plan itself was revolutionary. 6 aircraft carriers would travel more than 3,000 miles across the North Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence. They would avoid shipping lanes and remain undetected. At dawn, they would launch over 350 aircraft in 2 massive waves, targeting battleships, airfields, and fuel depots. No nation had ever attempted a carrier strike on this scale before. Meanwhile, the United States had warnings, many of them. American cryptographers had cracked parts of Japan's diplomatic code, known as Purple. Daily intercepts revealed negotiations were collapsing. Tokyo was preparing for war. But here was the problem. No one knew where the first blow would fall. Military planners believed Japan would strike the Philippines, British Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies. These targets made sense. They were closer, strategically valuable. Hawaii seemed too distant, too bold, too risky. So Pearl Harbor was considered safe. This assumption would prove fatal. On November 27, 1941, commanders across the Pacific received a message labeled a war warning. But it was vague. It mentioned possible attacks in Southeast Asia. It emphasized sabotage, not air assault. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short prepared for internal threats. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage. Anti-aircraft ammunition was locked away. Radar coverage was limited. Patrols were minimal. They were guarding against the wrong danger. Early on the morning of December 7th, 2 young radar operators detected something massive approaching from the north. Their screen showed dozens of aircraft closing fast. They reported it immediately. But the officer on duty assumed it was a scheduled group of American B-17 bombers arriving from California. No alarm was raised. That was the final warning. At 7:48 a.m., Japanese planes dove out of the clouds. Torpedoes slammed into battleships. Bombs exploded across the harbor. The USS Arizona was hit, detonating its ammunition magazine. A fireball shot into the sky, killing more than 1,100 men in seconds. Sailors burned alive. Others jumped into oil-covered water that caught fire around them. Chaos erupted. Within 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet was devastated. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. The United States had been punched in the face. So how did this happen? The failure wasn't one mistake. It was a chain reaction of errors. First was confirmation bias. American leaders believed Japan would attack closer targets, so every piece of intelligence was filtered through that belief. When warnings didn't match expectations, they were ignored. Second was poor communication. Washington had valuable intelligence, but it wasn't shared clearly with commanders in Hawaii. Some messages arrived too late. Others were watered down. No one connected the dots. Third was underestimating the enemy. Many American officials believed Japanese pilots lacked the skill for complex carrier operations. They assumed Japan was incapable of such a bold strike. That arrogance proved deadly. Fourth was a failure of imagination. No one seriously considered that Japan would attempt something this daring. A carrier strike across thousands of miles of ocean seemed impossible. So it was dismissed. Even when Japanese diplomats delivered a final message, breaking off negotiations, a clear sign of war, it reached Washington after the bombs had already fallen. The warning came too late. In the aftermath, investigations exploded. Congress demanded answers. The public wanted someone to blame. Admirals Kimmel and Short were relieved of command, their reputations destroyed. They became convenient scapegoats, but the truth was bigger than them. The failure was systemic. Too many agencies, too little coordination, too much assumption, not enough urgency. Pearl Harbor forced the United States to completely rebuild its intelligence system. Information sharing improved. Threat analysis became more aggressive. Never again would the country ignore warnings so casually. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. America declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. World War II became truly global. The attack that was meant to weaken America did the opposite. It united the nation. Factories roared to life. Women filled industrial jobs. Millions enlisted. The full industrial might of the United States was unleashed. Battleships were replaced. Aircraft carriers dominated the seas. 4 years later, Japan lay defeated. And it all started because warnings were ignored, because signals were misread, because leaders assumed the enemy wouldn't dare. Pearl Harbor wasn't inevitable. It was preventable. But history doesn't care about what could have been, only what happened. And on that quiet Sunday morning, intelligence failed, and the world changed forever.